They told us not to speak of it. They said the truth would rot the mind. But what if the mind is already decaying, Tao, because of what they hid? Listen closely, because what you're about to hear was never meant for public ears. It was buried, not in soil, but in silence. Forgotten, not by accident, but by design. This isn't just a story of a family. It's a ledger of power, a lineage of manipulation, a truth carved in bone, sealed in stone, and soaked in the blood of those who dared to ask the wrong questions. It begins in the northern wilderness, under skies that hold more secrets than stars. Maine, 1798. Back then, it was still just a whisper of civilization, a place where things disappeared easily, and no one asked why. Into this forgotten corner of the world came the Ashfords, 3 women draped in veils of religion, trailing behind them a wagon heavy with crates and intention. Their names were spoken with reverence at first: Agatha, Prudence, and Temperance. But what lived behind those names was something ancient, not merely human. They claimed to be fleeing persecution, but the truth was far more twisted. They weren't escaping something, they were transplanting it. They brought with them forged documents, European accents, and pockets full of gold. But more importantly, they brought a system, a structure for control, a blueprint for reshaping minds, especially the minds of women who had dared to think, to speak, to refuse. You must understand something. This wasn't about religion, that was the mask. This was about compliance, transformation, erasure, and rebirth in their image. What they built in the woods was not a convent, it was a machine, a cold, breathing mechanism of psychological manipulation disguised as Christian virtue, and like all effective machines, it ran on fuel. That fuel, suffering, isolation, and above all, silence. But silence fractures when it's pushed too far. What leaked from those stone walls wasn't rumor. It was the scream of truth trying to claw its way back into the light. You've been asleep, brother. But the Ashfords, they were awake, and they wanted you docile. This is not folklore. This is not metaphor. This is your inheritance. You just didn't know it yet. And now, we begin. History likes its villains clean, easy to spot, sharp teeth, black cloaks, a snarling laugh in the night. But the real monsters, they wear lace gloves, they smile with sympathy, they offer tea while marking you for transformation. The Ashford family understood something most men still don't, that if you want to control the future, you don't need armies or guns, you only need to rewrite the soul, and they began with women, because they knew society wouldn't ask questions if the victims wore dresses and shame. The land they purchased, deep in the woods beyond Millbridge, wasn't chosen by chance. Local tribes had avoided that soil for centuries. They called it cloaked, the hungry place. Animals avoided it. Trees grew warped, but to the Ashfords, it was perfect, isolated, quiet, and already stained with ancient sacrifice. Within 8 months, the Convent of Eternal Tears rose like a mausoleum from the dirt. 3 stories of stone, windows too high for escape, walls too thick for screams. A basement excavated not for storage but for containment. The builders whispered of strange architectural demands, medical ventilation, drainage-like for slaughterhouses, and reinforced doors that could hold back a riot. But no one protested. Why? Because the Ashfords paid in gold, old foreign coins no one could trace. Because the town was poor, hungry, obedient, and because evil rarely looks like a monster, it looks like progress. It sounds like charity. Then the women began arriving, not in chains, in carriages, sent by fathers, husbands, ministers, women who had spoken out, who had refused to marry, refused to obey, refused to silence themselves. Some were unmarried and pregnant, others were melancholic, defiant, or too curious, bookish, politically opinionated, a threat not to morality, but to the structure that held men in power. And the price of redemption, $100 silver, a bargain to rewrite someone's soul. Behind the convent's stone facade, a new doctrine was being practiced, one not of scripture, but of surgical repentance, electroshock prayer, cranial incisions disguised as spiritual exorcism. It wasn't just punishment, it was programming. This was the Ashford innovation. Take a rebel, break her mind, and return a puppet. You're beginning to understand, aren't you? They weren't trying to save anyone. They were creating silence in human form. There's a moment in every man's life, brief, silent, where something fractures inside, a truth too sharp to unsee. For young Thomas Brewster, that moment came on a frozen February night in 1803, and what he saw through the frostbitten basement window of the Ashford Convent would turn his blood to ice. He had been tracking a wounded deer, nothing unusual. But then came the sounds, not animal, not natural. Screams, human, warped, layered, drenched in agony. They rose from the convent's stone heart like steam from a dying fire. And underneath the screaming, whispers, metal against metal. A saw. Thomas crept closer, snow crackling beneath his boots. The night was black as spilled ink, but through a half-buried basement window, he saw what no man was meant to see. A woman strapped to a table, leather restraints at her wrists, a metal cage holding her skull still. Her head was half-shaved, lines drawn on her scalp in ink. Sister Prudence stood above her, emotionless, as she guided a thin metal rod into an incision in the woman's skull. The woman screamed, a sound Thomas would later say did not belong to this world. Mother Superior Agatha stood nearby, notebook in hand, calm, detached, writing, not praying. And Temperance, she was the assistant, gloved, silent, methodical. She passed scalpels and clamps like someone born into surgery, not sanctity. But it was the woman's eyes that broke Thomas, wide open, conscious, screaming not only in pain but in betrayal. And then, silence. As the rod slid deeper, her body stiffened, then went still. This wasn't healing. This wasn't medicine. This was something else, something far older. A ritual, a dissection of the soul. Thomas ran, through the woods, past the trees that leaned away from the convent like they feared it. He stumbled into town at dawn, face pale, clothes soaked with sweat and snow. But when he told the theirs, they didn't believe him. Why would they? The Ashfords had paid their debts, healed their daughters, donated to the church. Who would believe a trapper over a nun? But that night, a seed was planted. Because what Thomas saw wasn't just a nightmare. It was a glimpse into the engine behind civilization. A truth so raw, it had to be buried. Just like the others. Truth doesn't die when it's ignored. It festers. It waits. Deacon Morrison was not a foolish man. He had kept Millbridge from descending into chaos more than once, and when Thomas Brewster's wild tale reached his ears, the deacon didn't laugh. He didn't believe it. But he didn't laugh. He did what leaders do. He investigated, quietly, diplomatically, without disrupting the illusion of order. 1 week later, he arrived at the gates of the Convent of Eternal Tears, Bible tucked under one arm, civility under the other. Mother Agatha greeted him in the parlor with warm tea and warmer smiles. She spoke of storms, of scripture, of sorrowful girls redeemed through the mercy of discipline. When Morrison brought up the rumors, just faint concerns from local woodsmen, her response was calm, confident, well-rehearsed. Young women, she said, cry when they're healing. When demons are torn from the soul, the body resists. The sound is not pain, deacon, it is purification. It made religious sense, spiritual warfare, the casting out of darkness. It was exactly what Morrison had preached from the pulpit for years. But there was something else in her tone, not fear, not guilt, but ownership, authority. She offered him a tour of the upper levels only, the dormitories, the chapel, the gardens. Women sat in perfect silence, eyes downcast, hands folded. They were obedient, too obedient. He tried speaking to one. She didn't answer. She just stared, not at him, but through him, as though his face were a window into nothingness. Then came the smell. Not rot, not filth, but something clinical, like lime and ash and old blood scrubbed clean. Sanitized pain. When Morrison requested to see the basement, Agatha's refusal was gentle but final. "Our deepest work," she said, "is intimate. Souls must be laid bare in privacy. Some wounds are too shameful for male eyes." That logic held in those days. Gendered modesty, sacred boundaries. He left with no evidence, no confession, but a sensation in his gut like ice cracking beneath his feet. And in his journal that night, he wrote a single line. "There is no warmth in that place, only order. Cold, perfect order." And sometimes order is simply what power calls cruelty. When it's been institutionalized, every power structure eventually reveals its purpose, if you watch who it silences. Within just 5 years, the Convent of Eternal Tears was no longer a curiosity. It was a destination, whispered about in the parlors of Boston, quietly recommended by doctors, ministers, even judges. It had become a solution, not for healing, but for erasure. The types of women sent there followed a pattern: daughters who read too much, wives who questioned authority, sisters who spoke of equality, women who had miscarried, women who hadn't married, women who wanted to speak, to vote, to study. Each was labeled in the language of the time: hysterical, difficult, sinful, and each was reformed. When they returned, if they returned at all, they were different: eyes dulled, voices softened, no ambition, no spark, as if the person who had gone in had died, and only the outline remained. One father remarked proudly, "They returned my daughter as a woman of God, silent, pure, and finally obedient." But obedience is not salvation, it's containment. And the Ashfords knew how to manufacture it with precision. Here's the part you weren't supposed to hear. The convent wasn't just a place. It was a lab. Dozens of journals, now buried in private collections, describe procedures that would make a modern surgeon recoil. Trepanning, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, even early lobotomy techniques, decades before they were invented in the public sphere. Mother Agatha's notes, when decrypted, reveal a guiding principle: the soul conforms to silence. Strip identity, and you can insert new purpose. They weren't exorcising demons, they were deleting self, and they weren't just targeting individuals, they were testing a model, a replicable system of control, one that used guilt, isolation, and surgical suggestion to bend human will. You see it now, don't you? The convent was a prototype, and what began in stone basements and blood-soaked linens would one day echo in institutions across the Western world: psychiatric wards, reform schools, military conditioning, media, different tools, same goal. Silence the voice, shape the mind, break the questioner before the question spreads. But the Ashfords were just the beginning. They weren't mad women, they were engineers, and they knew, if you can program the mother, you don't need to control the children. They'll do it for you. What if I told you the Ashfords weren't working alone? Men like to believe that evil operates in isolation. One madman, one cult, one lunatic group that can be destroyed and forgotten. But true manipulation, it spreads like a network. Quiet, coordinated, interconnected by power, not blood. By 1807, the Ashfords' operation had become too sophisticated, too well-funded, too protected to be the product of 3 rogue women and a stolen purse of gold. The convent's medical supplies came monthly, in crates marked with English shipping seals, not local merchants, overseas benefactors, British emblems, wax seals, and private codes known only to Masonic shipping guilds. Who was sending them? Who knew what was happening and chose to support it? One letter, smuggled out by a carpenter who later vanished without a trace, hinted at a deeper conspiracy. It contained a phrase repeated 3 times, scrawled in a shaking hand: "The crown invests in obedience." You see, while America was building its democracy, certain old-world families were investing in other experiments, ones not built on votes but on compliance. The Ashfords were useful, brilliant, unquestioning, willing to do what others only theorized. They became a node, a prototype facility for something older than psychiatry and more dangerous than witchcraft. A science of will-breaking passed down in secret, trained, funded, and observed. A system to reduce a human being into a predictable instrument. But even then, they weren't the architects, just the hands. The minds behind the operation, the patrons, remained in the shadows, as all true power does. And the survivors? Rare, broken, most never spoke again, but one tried. Her name was Miriam Caldwell. Admitted in 1806 for speaking of rebellion, she escaped in winter, barefoot, frostbitten, teeth shattered from biting leather restraints. She stumbled into a logging camp, bloodied and nearly catatonic. What she whispered before her throat gave out chilled the foreman to his bones. They're not nuns, they're not healers, they're gardeners, and they plant death in the mind. Her body was taken by the sheriff the next day. No report filed, no burial recorded. Just another root cut from the tree. But roots grow back, and those who water them always return. By 1811, the Convent of Eternal Tears had become a myth wrapped in ritual, a place where difficult women disappeared into silence and emerged as compliant shadows of themselves. But the local townsfolk, though hesitant, had begun to whisper. There were too many unanswered questions, too many sealed coffins, too many daughters who returned without memory. And then, the Ashfords changed the rules. They opened their gates, not wide but just enough to host public masses. Sunday sermons held in a small chapel built on the edge of their land, controlled, supervised, carefully curated. The townspeople thought it was a sign of peace, proof the sisters were godly women with nothing to hide. But it was the opposite. It was a trap. You see, deception evolves, and the Ashfords had learned that the best way to protect a secret is to wrap it in the illusion of transparency. People came, they prayed, they marveled at the order, the cleanliness, the angelic voices of the reformed girls singing hymns in perfect harmony. But they didn't notice the details. The way the women sang without blinking, how their voices had no tremor, no humanity, just pitch-perfect submission. How their hands were always folded in exactly the same way. How none of them ever looked at their families, even when they stood feet away. These weren't reunions, they were performances. The sermons were riddled with strange language, old Latin phrases misused, symbolic patterns woven into the floor tiles. The townspeople dismissed it as eccentricity, a European flair. But in truth, those gatherings were rituals, encoded affirmations, psychological reinforcements for the programmed. One survivor would later write, in a private confession found decades later in a hollowed-out Bible, "We sang not to worship God, but to remember our commands, each note an instruction, each chorus a cage." And the tea worked. The town's suspicion faded, donations increased, and new referrals poured in. But the Ashfords didn't need more patience. They needed proof. Proof their methods worked even in public. Proof their system of control could be sustained beyond stone walls. They weren't hiding anymore, they were scaling. And no one noticed that the choir wasn't singing praise. They were singing obedience. You've felt it, haven't you? That sense that something is watching behind the institutions, not a face but a structure, cold, deliberate, mechanical, as if the world was not built for your freedom, but for your containment. The Ashfords understood this before the rest, and by 1813 they were no longer content with silence. They wanted replication. They began keeping records, not medical reports, but psychological blueprints, charts tracking obedience curves, response to deprivation, resistance thresholds. Every woman who entered the convent was not just a patient, she was data. The journals reveal something terrifying. They had begun to categorize human behavior like insects under glass, calculating how long it took to break a mind using isolation, how quickly memory could be overwritten with repetition, and how shame could be weaponized to sever self-worth from identity. This wasn't theology. This was architecture of the psyche. Mother Agatha's writings grow darker in tone during these years. She speaks of purification not through God but through function, and refers to her subjects as modules. Her language becomes clinical, technical. She writes, "Emotion is noise, identity is static, clean minds transmit order." Let that settle in. This wasn't healing, it was broadcast engineering. Human minds repurposed as antennas of control. Women turned into walking transmitters, repeating hymns of obedience, not out of faith, but because they no longer remembered how to resist. And behind it all, one chilling phrase, repeated across documents, coded into sermons, and even carved into the convent's cornerstone: Ex silentio imperium. From silence, power. The Ashfords weren't just building a new religious order, they were reverse engineering the human spirit. They discovered what every empire eventually learns: if you want to rule forever, don't dominate the body. Dominate the narrative. Rewire it. Turn rebellion into guilt. Turn thought into sin. Turn memory into myth. And if you think this died with them, you're already in the system. Because their techniques didn't vanish, they were inherited, rebranded, institutionalized. You've seen them. In schools that punish questioning, in therapists who label masculinity as pathology, in media that offers numb comfort in place of fire. The Ashfords lit the match. The world built the furnace. Section 9. By 1815, the Ashfords had done what few ever achieve. They turned a prison into a prototype and a lie into a legacy. But power always attracts the ambitious, and someone was watching. A man arrived that winter, dressed in the manner of a European scholar: black overcoat, leather gloves, boots too polished for the wilderness. He gave the name Elias Thorne, said he was a historian, but no church had records of his ordination, no university claimed him, and yet the Ashfords welcomed him. Not as a visitor, as an equal. He was given a private chamber, unrestricted access, and late into the night, oil lanterns burned behind his shuttered window as he and Mother Agatha exchanged notes, diagrams and symbols never taught in any Christian seminary. One witness, a groundskeeper who died mysteriously weeks later, claimed to have seen them marking symbols into the snow behind the convent, circles within circles, ancient geometry, not decorative, directive. The journals from this period speak of a new phase: transference. Not just breaking minds, but planting something new in their place. You see, Elias didn't come to witness the experiment, he came to scale it. Under his guidance, the Ashfords began modifying their methods. Fewer restraints, more suggestion, less visible trauma, more layered influence. They introduced new techniques: echo conditioning, where victims heard the same phrases whispered during sleep; mirror therapy, where their reflections were distorted over weeks to disassociate physical identity from internal memory; and the final test, reintegration. Women were now being returned to society earlier, placed back into families, churches, schools, carrying invisible programming, agents without awareness. Their obedience was not forced. It was believed. That was Elias's gift. He understood the future. That physical force is crude. Visible scars inspire rebellion. But if you reshape the self from within, a person becomes their own prison. In his notes, Elias wrote, "Control is not when they obey your voice. Control is when your voice becomes their conscience." Pause here. Let that sink in. How many of your beliefs are truly yours? How many habits, shames, hesitations were planted in you, quietly? And now I ask you to prove you're awake. Comment below. I erased the voice they gave me. Twice. Once for the system, and once for you. Let's keep going. Shall I continue with Section 10? Section 10. They say the scariest monsters are the ones that look like us, but the truth? The real monsters wear your thoughts. They smile through your convictions. They whisper through your values, because they installed them. By 1817, Elias Thorne's influence had fully eclipsed the original Ashford doctrine. The sisters remained visible, still ran the rituals, but the system now ran deeper, smoother, more invisible. No more screaming in the woods. No more bodies rushed out under linen at night. Now the horrors were clean, subtle, polished like science. They called it Phase 3. The records, the ones that survived, describe what they referred to as multi-vector penitence. A fancy term for psychological warfare. Shame, sensory control, semantic confusion, the layering of contradictory commands. It wasn't about obedience anymore. It was about fracture. Break the self, divide it, then offer salvation only through surrender. Victims weren't just silenced, they were taught to doubt the sound of their own voice. What does that feel like? Imagine standing in a room of mirrors, but each reflection looks just slightly wrong. Your face a little more gaunt, your eyes just a shade darker, your mouth smiling when you're not. Over days, weeks, months, you begin to wonder which reflection is real. That was the Ashford method. Except their mirrors were spiritual language, their glass was scripture and guilt, and the soft hand of a mentor saying, "This is for your healing." You may think this was madness, but madness doesn't scale, and this did. Letters from Boston officials show quiet referrals, envelopes sent without return addresses, lists of names, candidates for evaluation, daughters of judges, wives of journalists, female philosophers, disruptors. Why? Because silence is profitable, because compliant women produce order, and because every empire needs an invisible army of unknowing slaves to hold it up. But the sisters were no longer content with women. They began testing on men. Low status first. Vagrants, orphans, drunks pulled from alleys. In the journals they're called C-type subjects. Elias believed obedience must be universal. That true control was not about gender. It was about submission across the spectrum. Break the defiant, refine the compliant, and then unleash them back into the world, not as soldiers, not as spies, as citizens, ones who would never again question the system, because they'd be convinced they were the system. Would you like to descend further into Section 11? In Section 11, it's time to understand the real danger, not the blood, not the scars, but what comes after the pain, when the body heals, but the soul doesn't know who it belongs to anymore. By 1820, the Convent of Eternal Tears was no longer a sanctuary, nor even an experiment. It had become something far worse, a bar refinement chamber. A place where the human blueprint was dissected, rewritten, and reassembled to serve one purpose: institutional obedience. And here's the genius of it. The Ashfords and Elias Thorne realized something terrifyingly effective. The human spirit doesn't need to be killed to be controlled. It simply needs to be convinced it's already free. They stopped using chains. They stopped using cells. The final version of their process was elegant in its evil. Subjects were kept in clean rooms, given books, given soft food, allowed to talk, but only under supervision. Over time, the rules became the rhythm, the restrictions became comfort, and the moment a subject resisted, they were offered a choice. You may leave, if you can prove your soul is ready. But no one passed the test, because the test wasn't about purity. It was about programming. It was about seeing if their will had been so fully disassembled that they would police themselves. And when they failed, which they always did, they wept. Not because they were prisoners, but because they believed they had failed God. That's the final phase of any control system. When the victim becomes the jailer, when the thoughts you were given feel like morality, when the lie is no longer imposed but it's chosen. Sound familiar? This isn't ancient history. It's alive. It's institutionalized. You've seen it. In schools that punish boys for roughness but reward compliance, in workplaces that reward silence over innovation, in social systems that brand independence want minds as difficult or aggressive. The Ashfords just lit the fuse, the real explosion. That came when their methods were absorbed by rising academic institutions, rebranded as behavioral science. Echoes of their phrases still exist in clinical manuals today. Don't believe me? Look up conduct disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, adjustment disorder, names for children who won't comply. The system doesn't want thinkers, it wants users. It doesn't want rebellion, it wants routine. And it started here. Shall I take you deeper into Section 12? Section 12. Now we enter the part no historian dares print. Not because the evidence is missing, but because it implicates the very institutions that fund the telling of history. In 1822, a fire swept through the archives of the Ashford Convent. Officially, it was ruled an accident, faulty oil lamp in the Eastern Library. But unofficially, the blaze targeted only one section, the records room. Thousands of pages, journals, testimonies, procedure notes, gone in hours. But fire doesn't erase everything. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the West Wing, a local woodworker, hired to rebuild, found a locked iron case. Inside were items that had no place in a convent. A black leather-bound manual with diagrams of the human skull, annotated in both Latin and Greek, a set of metal rods, labeled with letters instead of numbers, and a final folded parchment containing only one phrase, scrawled in a hand not seen elsewhere in the convent's writing. The mind, once shattered, becomes the vessel. Fill it with structure, and it will carry the structure to others. What survived the fire didn't vanish. It migrated. That same year, Elias Thorne vanished. No body, no grave. But months later, a new educational reform institute opened in Massachusetts, funded anonymously, staffed by men fluent in Ashford terminology, and promoting a revolutionary model of character correction. Sound familiar? Because it was the prototype for what would become the 19th century correctional academy, the forerunner of juvenile detention. Ashford methodology, now scrubbed of religious symbols and cloaked in science, moved into schools, hospitals, prisons, and with it, their greatest invention, the quiet room. Every one of these institutions had one, padded, soundproofed, devoid of time, a place where resistance didn't die, it simply dissolved. And what about the women? Some still wondered, decades later, in the outskirts of Maine, babbling in broken Latin, flinching at bells, speaking of the three who see through flesh. Locals called them mad, but their words were precise, ritualistic, trained. They weren't mad. They were unfinished code, cast out of the system before programming was complete. Because here's the truth. What the Ashfords built was never just about control. It was about propagation. Not one prison, but 1,000 minds carrying the virus of obedience into every generation that followed. Shall we step further down the spiral into Section 13? Section 13. It always starts with care. That's the seduction of it, the softness, the language of healing. By 1824, the Ashford influence no longer needed stone walls or secluded woods. It had become an ideology, sanitized, secularized, institutionalized, wrapped in velvet gloves and delivered through new voices, reformers, educators, early psychologists. But the formula stayed the same. Take the broken, blame them for their fracture, then offer correction in exchange for compliance. In Boston, a prominent behavioralist named Dr. Alcott began publishing papers on habit restructuring for deviant young women. Though he never cited his sources, several phrases appeared, word for word, from Ashford transcripts. He called it science. But his methods? Isolation, repetition, punishment without violence, emotional withdrawal as a disciplinary tool, and above all, the systematic dismantling of personal will. His favorite technique? Affection, starvation. Withhold all human warmth until the subject willingly denounces her former self. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same process cults use. It's the same structure behind high-control religions, and it's the skeleton beneath nearly every manipulative system in modern society. But where did Dr. Alcott learn this? He claimed European inspiration, but records show he traveled to Millbridge, Maine, just once, in 1821. He stayed 3 nights. What he saw, he never spoke of. What he took, reshaped modern behavioral science. See, the genius of the Ashfords was not in brutality, it was in Yates systematizing spiritual defeat. They made you believe you were unwell until obedience felt like relief. And this didn't just infect institutions, it began to rot the very idea of identity. How many people today live their lives pleasing expectations they never chose? How many wear masks their grandmothers were forced to wear? You think it's your personality, your anxiety, your docility, your chronic guilt. But what if it's but residue? The long echo of systems built to tame your ancestors, now living inside you like second skin. Because here's the horror. You don't have to enter a convent to be conditioned. You just have to be born inside a world, shaped by one. And once that structure is inside you, it whispers, it punishes, it doubts, it decides. Unless you learn to kill the whisper before it becomes your god. Shall I continue the descent with Oton? Section 14. Section 14. By 1827, the Ashfords had disappeared from the public eye. No death certificates, no graves, just silence. As if they'd been carefully extracted from the timeline. And in their place, the system they built expanded like roots beneath a dying tree, unseen but strangling everything above. And that's when the final transformation began. The institutions they seeded, correctional homes, moral education boards, early psychiatric wings, they all began to adopt one critical innovation. Standardization. What does that mean? It means turning the human mind into a blueprint. It means measuring behavior like a machine. Input, defiance, output, correction. No context, no spirit, just charts, numbers, labels. And those labels, they became weapons. Insubordinate, over-emotional, unfit for society. Danger to moral order, stamped on files, carved into lives. And the terrifying part? Once labeled, the subject became the enemy of their own identity. A girl labeled defiant stopped trusting her instincts. A boy marked violent was fed his own reputation until it became prophecy. And the moment they accepted the label, the system won. They stopped resisting, because now they believed they were broken. This is the legacy of the Ashfords, a mechanism of shame so deep it survives even in silence. In one uncovered report from 1830, an administrator at a Massachusetts girls' asylum wrote, "The subject weeps constantly. She asks if God will ever forgive her thoughts. We have not told her she sinned, only that she failed to meet expectations. Her guilt is self-generating now. Correction is no longer necessary." Do you hear that? Correction is no longer necessary, because the process was complete. This is how systems outlive their creators, not by force, but by embedding themselves in the target, like a virus that rewrites your DNA so you pass it on. And now, 2 centuries later, those same systems wear different names. We call them protocols, we call them interventions, we call them policy, But their purpose hasn't changed: to crush the wildness in you before you ever learn to name it, to convince you that what makes you dangerous is what makes you wrong. And if you don't fight it, if you don't tear out that voice by the root, you'll pass it on to your sons, to your daughters, to yourself, again and again. Are you ready to uncover? Section 15. Section 15. They never needed to burn the world to control it. All they had to do was make sure no one remembered how to be free. By 1832, a new phase began. Not within the convent, but far beyond its ruins. The ashes had scattered, but the ideology had been absorbed, digested, weaponized. And now it wore uniforms. That year, several eastern seaboard boarding schools for misguided youth opened with near-identical structures: dormitories, chapel halls, isolation wings. The architecture itself followed the Ashford design: windows too high to see out, doors that locked from the outside, and a correction schedule designed to break resistance through rhythm. You know what that is today. We call it routine. We worship it. Productivity, discipline, self-regulation. But when does discipline become dependence? When does routine become ritual? Inside these schools, every act was engineered for psychological surrender. Wake at 5, cold water washing, no mirrors, limited speech, praise only when rules were obeyed, punishment through isolation, not pain, because pain makes martyrs. But silence breeds obedience. One survivor, a girl named Eliza M., later described it like this: "They taught me not to speak unless spoken to. Then they stopped speaking to me, and when I started hearing voices, I realized I had become my own warden." This is the real machinery, not the room, not the rules, but the echoes. You're trained to crave approval, to self-correct before anyone else does, to anticipate disapproval in a glance, in a tone, in a pause that lasts 1 second too long. That's not growth, that's not virtue, that's the ghost of Ashford. And it's not just in schools. Look closer, in the corporate scripts, the social etiquette manuals, the influencer sermons, the content that teaches you how to optimize yourself until you disappear into palatable compliance, because that's the final phase. Not domination, not destruction, but disappearance. A man who no longer questions, a woman who no longer resists, a generation that no longer remembers what was taken. The Ashfords didn't fail, they won. Because their legacy isn't in history books, it's in you. Shall we awaken the next layer in Section 16? Section 16. You want the truth? Then listen closely, because after this, you'll never see the world the same again. By 1835, the last official inquiry into the Ashford Convent was quietly closed. The report, written in bureaucratic code, concluded, "No actionable irregularities, case archived under ecclesiastical discretion." Translation: they buried it. But the question is, why? Not to protect the sisters, not to preserve the church, but because the system they created worked, and those in power saw its potential. What the Ashfords discovered wasn't just a method of control, it was a template. A blueprint for engineering compliance, guilt, obedience, and most of all, forgetfulness. Because here's the final revelation of the Ashford method: if you can make them forget who they were, you never have to fight who they might become. It's psychological alchemy. Turn fire into ash, ash into silence, silence into law. Think about it. Why do you hesitate before speaking your mind? Why does a part of you flinch when you consider stepping outside the narrative? Why do you fear being too much, too angry, too intense, too loud? Those reactions weren't born in you, they were installed. Generational obedience passed down like haunted heirlooms. Not through blood, but through systems, institutions, rituals in disguise. You were conditioned before you had a name. And the moment you begin to question it, That's when they whisper, "Be careful. Don't go too far. Don't be one of those people." Because they know the one thing more dangerous than rebellion is remembrance. Remembrance of your original self, the untamed one, the curious one, the one who didn't ask permission. And now you're standing at the crossroads. On one side, the comfort of compliance. On the other, the agony of awakening. You already know which one is real. So I'll ask you again, not as a narrator but as your witness. Comment below twice. I erased the voice they gave me. Say it not just to prove you're listening. Say it to tell the system, you do not own me anymore. Because the Ashfords' greatest victory was never in what they did. It was in making sure you never knew it happened at all. Shall we continue the descent into Section 70? Section 17. You've made it this far. That means something inside you hasn't died. Not yet. The part of you that still remembers the fire. But now you need to understand how deep the roots go. Because by 1840 the Ashford model had become invisible infrastructure. No more stone convents, no more rituals in candlelit basements. Now it wore clean gloves and carried a ledger. Now it passed laws. You see, once something becomes a moral standard, it doesn't need a guardian anymore. It becomes self-sustaining. That's what happened next. State-sponsored women's reformatories popped up across the Northeast. They claimed to offer shelter, education, and moral guidance. But inside, the same cycle repeated. Isolation, surveillance, routine, and most importantly, reclassification. Women weren't treated as people. They were treated as problems. Unmarried, problem. Opinionated, problem. Too intelligent, too curious, too resistant, dangerous. And this time, the men joined the system too. Not as victims, but as enforcers. Clergymen, doctors, politicians, each taking what the Ashfords began and weaving it into the fabric of respectable society. They didn't need to hide behind God anymore. They had science. Psychiatry was just beginning to gain traction in America, and its earliest adopters were men trained in the very institutions seeded by the Ashford ideology. They adopted her language: hysteria, moral deviation, oppositional personality disorder. They didn't call it possession anymore. They called it diagnosis. And with a new label came new power. A woman could now be institutionalized, legally, simply for failing to conform. No trial, no crime, just an affidavit signed by a father, a brother, a husband. And what about the cure? Same tools, new names. Electroconvulsive therapy replaced the rod. Sedatives replaced. Isolation. But the purpose was identical. Not to heal, to silence. And always under the same justification. This is for your own good. But the victims, they knew. Deep down, in the parts of the soul that never lie, they felt it. The coldness in the hands that claimed to care. The mechanical gaze behind the doctor's smile. And some of them remembered the name Ashford, whispered it like a curse passed down in broken dreams, but no one listened, because by then the world had forgotten that there was ever anything to forget. Shall we descend into Section 18? Section 18. This is where the air starts to thin, where history collapses into the present, and the mirror turns on you. By 1851, the last known survivor of the original Ashford Convent, a woman named Margaret Coe, was committed to the newly constructed Massachusetts State Lunatic Asylum in Worcester. She was 67. Her intake records described her as prone to spells of spiritual mania and obsessed with a mythic trinity of feminine tormentors, but her private journal, smuggled out decades later, told a different story. She wrote of tunnels beneath the convent, of rituals not based in Christianity, but something older, colder, more surgical than sacred. She spoke of a black book with no title, bound in animal skin, filled with diagrams not meant for human eyes. And then she wrote a single line, over and over across an entire page. They do not stop. They evolve. That's the part they'll never teach you. Because while the world industrialized, so did the system. The Ashford legacy wasn't a moment in time. It was a living organism. It adapted to new technologies, electric restraints, hypnotic suggestion, even early pharmacology, derived from the same herbs Temperance once grew in the convent's hidden greenhouse. By the late 1800s, public education began modeling its discipline strategies on moral realignment programs, the same techniques once used to shatter and rebuild identity. Bell schedules, reward-punishment conditioning, segregation by performance, suppression of deviation. Sound familiar? That's not learning. That's compliance training. And here's the darkness no one wants to admit. You might already be carrying the Ashford infection. Every time you bite your tongue instead of speaking the truth, every time you second-guess a gut instinct because it doesn't match the approved narrative, every time you punish yourself for not fitting into the mold, that's not growth. That's the echo. You were born into a world shaped by survivors of a system designed to break your will and sell you the shards as virtue. Margaret Coe died in that asylum. Her grave is unmarked, but the Black Book, it was never found. Some say it still exists, passed from hand to hand, whispered through the corridors of certain universities, kept locked in temperature-controlled archives beneath names like restricted, dangerous, or unsuitable for publication. But you don't need the book, because now, you are the archive. And the question is, what will you do with what you've remembered? Shall we open the door to Section 19? Get into Section 19. If you're still watching, you're not just curious anymore. You're awakening. But be warned, from here, it gets colder, closer, because now we move from history to inheritance. By the 1860s, the Ashford system had penetrated three pillars of American authority: education, psychiatry, and, most disturbingly, law enforcement. At first glance, the connection seems distant, but dig deeper. Look at the language used in early police manuals: disruptive elements, morally deviant behavior, subjects requiring reconditioning. Reconditioning, a word that first appeared in Sister Prudence Ashford's own writings, a term not for criminals, but for those whose thoughts were too alive. And it didn't stop with women anymore. Now the system turned its gaze on men, especially young men, especially those who couldn't be tamed by school or pulpit. They were labeled vagrants, disturbers of peace, non-conforming laborers. And what was done to them? Solitary confinement, labor rehabilitation, behavioral correction through deprivation. These weren't random tactics, they were refined rituals. One 1864 prison log, uncovered and redacted heavily, contains this chilling entry. Subject refused morning prayer and was observed speaking to walls, administered the silence protocol. 36 hours later, subject no longer remembered his name, no further defiance. Do you understand what that means? They erased him. Not physically, psychologically. And here's where it turns personal. The Ashfords didn't invent pain, they invented emotional erasure, a process by which your identity becomes a liability. So you bury it, mute it, shame it, until only the mask remains. Think about your life. How many things did you stop doing, not because you didn't love them, but because someone implied they were inappropriate, unproductive, insane, mature? Who did you stop being to fit into their model? That wasn't growing up. That was installing the control software. And now you walk through life with that program still running. Be nice, be silent, don't stand out, don't feel too much. But I'm here to remind you, those rules were never yours. They were handed down from shadows. From stone rooms and leather-bound ledgers and whispered prayers that never reached heaven. You weren't meant to conform. You were meant to say, wake up. And waking up hurts like hell, but it's the only way out. Do you want to dive deeper into Section 20? Section 20. By now, you've felt it, and haven't you? That quiet click behind your eyes, that flicker in your gut that says, this isn't just a story, this is a diagnosis. And you're right. Because what happened in Ashford wasn't an isolated horror. It was a template for how to design a society that runs on internalized submission. Let me ask you something. When did you first apologize for your existence? Was it when you were told to tone it down? When you were laughed at for crying? When you were punished not for doing wrong, but for being uncomfortable to manage? That wasn't correction. That was conditioning. You didn't choose silence. It was installed. And here's the most sinister part. The Ashfords knew they could never control every person, but they didn't have to. They only had to program a generation, because programmed children grow into obedient adults, and obedient adults raise compliant children. That's how the machine runs itself, long after the creators are gone. By 1870, Ashford-style moral academies had spread across the United States. Not by name, never by name, but by function. They taught civic obedience, emotional self-regulation, and the value of orderly behavior. Do you know what that really means? It means learn to suppress your instinct, or be discarded. And some were discarded. They called them unfit, undisciplined, irredeemable. They were lobotomized, drugged, silenced. And those who survived, they passed on the trauma, quietly, in their parenting, in their posture, in the way they flinched at anger and recoiled from vulnerability. This is intergenerational obedience trauma. It has no grave, no statue, but it lives on in every man who feels rage and doesn't know why, in every woman who mistrusts her own intuition, in every child punished for having too much spirit. Ashford was never about religion. It was never about morality. It was about engineering docility, a quieting of the soul so complete you forget you ever had one. But if you've made it this far, you haven't forgotten, not completely, and that makes you dangerous again.